G'day YouTube. What's today? 17th of May. Yesterday's big news was that the silver bodgies died. Silver bodgie as in silver grey hair. Bodgie as in bodgies and woodgies. Or was it widgies? I don't know. I'm not actually that old. But anyway, the silver bodgie was Robert E. Lee Hawke, who was Australia's Labor Prime Minister after Malcolm Fraser and before Paul Keating. And I normally wouldn't give a little bit of a video memoir of a politician's life, but one of my older, longer time co-subscribers, Refried Bean Dip, how you going, Richard, asked me to say something about Bob Hawke dying. So, well, first time I recall hearing of Bob Hawke would have been maybe 1970-ish. And, you know, I would have been 9 years old. First becoming aware of individual politicians that my parents hated. And Bob Hawke was right up there because he was the president of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. And my father hated anybody who was anything at all supportive of unions. I'm pretty sure this was because in the 1930s he worked for his father. They had a little small business. They had a dozen employees. The American stock market crashed. Times was crook. They woke up one morning and the government had shut the banks. And they had to pay award wages, and they didn't have any money, didn't have any source of finance. And my old man came to see the unions as representing the workers as being the enemy, particularly after he bought the business off his father in 1948. So yeah, he hated Bob Hawke with an absolute passion. That was, yeah, all through my early teenage years. And my parents were so virulently anti-Labor, anti-left, anti any kind of socialist concept. When Gough Whitlam was elected, I actually recall having a literal expectation that on the Sunday morning, we perhaps as late as Monday, we would wake up to having secret police squads on every street corner to arrest anybody who was suspected of being a capitalist, because, you know, that's what they did in Russia. And Russia was communist and communist was socialist, and Gough Whitlam was Labor and Labor was socialist. So obviously we were going to have the KGB come running around the streets of Glen Innes within, at latest, 36 hours of Gough Whitlam being elected. And that just didn't happen. And that's when I began to notice that the side of politics my parents supported was actually full of shit. They were afraid of crap that never happened. And they blamed things that did happen on people who had nothing to do with it. So then I got shipped out to a couple of boarding schools. Next time I heard of Bob Hawke was at Chevalier College, Bowral, which is a sort of an upmarket Catholic boarding school. And it's for, it's not for blue collar Catholic kids, it's for white collar Catholic kids. And down there we were being taught to hate socialists and hate communists because the Cold War was on, and, you know, Alexander Solzhenitsyn was on the reading list and all the rest of it. And when the dismissal of Whitlam happened in 1975, we had a religious knowledge lesson in the period after the messenger come around class to class saying, oh, the Governor General's dismissed the Prime Minister and they're calling a double dissolution election. And the old priest, bald fellow, we called him Buffhead, who was taking the religious knowledge lesson, spent the next 50 minutes explaining to us that because Bob Hawke had made 4 public speeches urging the population to be calm and not to try to have a general strike, therefore the fact that he mentioned the term general strike 4 times, that clearly meant that he was trying to implant the idea of a general strike into the mind of the great unwashed sheeples out there in blue collar land. And that didn't happen either. So I come to realise that it wasn't just my parents who had the wrong ideas about Bob Hawke. And yeah, I didn't take much notice of him until he became Prime Minister. And that must have been 82 or 83. And what I really remember about Bob Hawke from that time was when he said that after Alan Bond, with stolen money, won the America's Cup, and all of Australia had sat up all the night watching the event occur, Bob Hawke said that if any boss sacked any employee for not going to work the day after we won the America's Cup, then that boss was a bum. And that sort of appealed to me and my generation at the time, and I think it appealed to a lot of Australians. So yeah, Bob Hawke was very appealing. He came from, I think, a place called Bordertown in South Australia, so he was pretty well connected to the land. He was a Rhodes Scholar, so he was as smart as a bloody whip. What he was most famous for when he was a university student in England was he got his name in the Guinness Book of Records for the fastest consumption of a pint of beer. I don't know what the record was. When he became Prime Minister, he gave up the booze for the time that he was the Prime Minister. As soon as he stopped Prime Minister, and he went back on the booze. And he died at 89. Not everything he did met with my approval, but a lot of it did. I'm pretty sure one of his kids, a daughter perhaps, was on the Nimbin hippie commune, so therefore Gough Whitlam made it possible to go off and live in the bush and be on the dole. Mal Fraser didn't undo any of that, and Bob Hawke sort of facilitated a lot of it. So I like that style of politics that he had. He came up with industrial peace with a sort of a wages and prices accord, and he was a Labor man to his core, and what the Labor Party wants is they want a fair wage for a fair day's pay in a safe workplace. They want to have sick leave. They want to have holiday leave. They want the holiday leave to be paid at an extra loading. They want to have workers' compensation if they get hurt on the job, and at the height of it, you were covered by workers' compensation from the moment you left your front gate until the moment you got back into it. You know, I literally know of one lady who was driving to work to attend her retirement party and had a car accident on the way to work. And because she was retiring at 55, maybe 50, 55, she was able to get another 5 years worth of salary on top of the retirement package because, oh, workers' comp, I hurt myself on the way to work. Whiplash, you know. So yeah, Bob Hawke was kind of in favour of all those kinds of things. And one thing that you can't escape is the fact that everybody who votes Labor wants to work for somebody who votes Liberal or National Party, because it's the business owners who have to come up with the concept of doing something where they can afford to pay somebody to spend their lifetime doing the actual job, and the entrepreneur is going to run that human at a profit. If you can't run an employee at a profit, there's no point employing them. When my father bought his father's business, as people left, he let them go, and he never put anybody on. And in 1930 something, 33 perhaps, they had 12 employees, and sometimes my father and his father went home with no money after paying the employees. When my old man was working for himself when I was a baby, The year I was born, I think he paid 12 pensions in income tax working on his own for himself in his workshop. It's a hard act to follow, I can tell you. Some of the other things that Bob Hawke did, I wasn't much in favour of, but once upon a time, I sold life insurance. And therefore I know that superannuation is a form of life insurance, and I know that the premiums that go into superannuation or life insurance are actually used by the company to invest on the short-term money market. So I knew that when Bob Hawke succumbed to Paul Keating's delusion that Australia could save itself from having to pay pensions if they introduced compulsory superannuation, I knew that wasn't actually going to work, because insurance doesn't work that way. That's not how it works. So therefore there's a lot of people who've just spent the last 30 or 40 years paying into a superannuation scheme are getting to try and retire. They're a little bit older than me and they're finding there's no money to retire on. They're going to be on the pension, They should have understood that from the beginning. So that was one of Bobby Hawke's blunders. A lot of people would say that one of Bobby Hawke's high points was when he burst into tears after watching the Tank Man dance in Tiananmen Square. I remember seeing that on the TV. I think it was around about the time my son was getting ready to be born. It was a great thing that he burst into tears, and he said that all the Chinese students in Australia did not have to go back home to face that sort of a regime. That was one of the good things he did. But then you got to balance that up against some of the really stupid things that he did. Like, there was that time when Madeleine Albright, she said in 1990 to Saddam Hussein, sad man who's insane, she said, the United States does not concern itself with minor internecine border disputes among its Arab client states. So a fortnight later, sad man who's insane invaded Kuwait, thinking he'd been given the green light. And as soon as he went across the border, George H.W. Bush decided NATO could use this event as an opportunity to fire off NATO's entire anti-Soviet arsenal. So instead of a peace dividend, NATO's military-industrial complex got 10 years' worth of guaranteed armament contracts to rearm NATO, because they just fired everything off in the desert. And as soon as Washington mentioned Bobby Hawke, Uncle Spam was going to go and beat the shit out of Iraq, Australia decided that we were going to get involved and go in there, and Australia offered troops before America asked. We helped to break the Middle East. That's why we're still bogged in Iraq again and Absurdistan, because that's what Uncle Spam did. Broke the Middle East in order to get a forever war. And it was bloody Bob Hawke who wanted to be a fucking wartime Prime Minister who got us stuck into that. So I reckon I'd have to say that Bob Hawke was a bit like the proverbial curate's egg. He was pretty good in parts. Some parts of him weren't so great. He was an alcoholic. After putting up with him for years and years and years and sticking by him through thick and thin, he left his missus and run away with his painted secretary or biographer, Blanche Delpage, which in my personal opinion is the act of a selfish individual. That's not really the way the game should be played. He owed his wife a pleasant old age until death did them part. And he didn't do that. He ran away with some other younger woman. Naughty boy. Bad. In the whole moral scheme of things, what was worse? Getting Australia involved in the First Iraq War or running away from his missus? And does being a good bloke after Tiananmen Square make up for all of that? As it says in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, judge not thy fellow human, lest thine own heart, soul, be weighed in the balance against the feather of truth and found to be wanting. By his own lights, he did the best he could with what he was presented with. He had a go at doing what the right thing was most of the time, but sometimes he did what he thought he could get away with. Requisat impasse, silver budgie. I mean bodgie. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.